Good evening and welcome to the Politicket Podcast. Tonight we have Randy Watt with us, former chief of the Ogden City Police, and it's good to have you, Randy.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's talk a little bit about law enforcement and some of the things you see going on right now. I know in the legislature we had quite a few justice reform bills that came forward, and I'd like to get your take on some of that went on and other things that are going on today across the country as far as police reform.
Sure. Well, as a chief, I sit on the Utah Chiefs Association, and I still do. In fact, we're still moving ahead there. But as a retired chief, my voice will still be heard in the process. We, as chiefs, we are the Chiefs Association. We're part of the Law Enforcement Legislative Committee that meets with legislators and looks at bills and studies bills and gives our position on behalf of law enforcement. There are 7 voting members in there that represent a variety of everything from the Attorney General's office to the Chiefs Association, Sheriff's Association, Department of Natural Resources, Law Enforcement, Corrections, and Statewide Association of Prosecutors, and a few others. So we meet as a group. We start well before the legislative session begins, and then as we receive word of bills and as bills start stacking up, we review them and we kind of give them an up or down in our opinion, or don't get involved kind of a ruling there. And then we look at them and we begin working with legislators to look at amendments, to look at changes, to look at different versions. And our primary job is to help legislators understand not only the initial impact of that bill, what it's going to do in terms of its effect on law enforcement, but what are the second and third order effects? What's going to happen downstream 2 years, 3 years, 5 years after this decision based on our expertise and education and training. And this year, this session, we had a lot of police reform bills. That's an interesting term because the goal wasn't to reform anything, the goal was to change things. The goal was to substantially change, on the part of a few activists, it was to substantially change the makeup of law enforcement and how law enforcement does business. Some of the bills were so extreme that they literally were attempting to do away with long-time court decisions currently in force and long-time full bodies of law as law enforcement occurs around the country. And so that was disturbing. It was probably the greatest effort we've seen yet in terms of my 40 years in law enforcement in terms of legal change. But we had a great relationship with the legislators, and we were able to accomplish a great deal of adjustment, amendment, change, and or even get support in stopping bills from even coming forward.
That's great. I know when I was reviewing any of the bills on law enforcement, I would look at your website and the list that you guys had developed, and right. I thought that was very helpful because you had a lot of interesting commentary on there about what the bill was about and what your position of the bill was, and so I found it interesting. One thing I wanted to ask you about was when we had the Black Lives Matter riots and stuff, I don't know if I use the word riot because here in Ogden it was actually quite peaceful.
Yeah.
And I thought, and I was just wondering, when we saw that, we saw Salt Lake just kind of disintegrate in some ways, but then we had this massive protest in Ogden, and it seemed perfectly peaceful. What was going on behind the scenes that made it that way, or is it just a different set of people?
We took, first, we have here in Ogden, the Ogden Police Department, the premier in the state, if not one of the premier in the country, and I mean that because we've been profiled by the Department of Justice for our Intelligence Fusion Center here in Ogden. So our Fusion Center was monitoring a wide variety of traffic, so we knew when things were coming. We were monitoring Facebook, we were monitoring even so far as the dark web, looking for conversations and keywords and things that identified what's coming. The second thing is we have in Ogden a mayoral administration that is law and order based, that understands that public safety, good order, public peace, all those things are tied together. And that the voices that were calling for more extreme behaviors are a very small minority of that. One thing we decided early on was that Ogden businesses would not pay the price. They're taxpayers, they're the economic engine of the city, would not pay the price for activism. So in some cities here, but around the country, you heard political administrations say, well, windows can be replaced and graffiti can be removed, and we need to give people space to vent their anger and their frustration. I think I find that most of the politicians say that have never run a small business. They don't know what an insurance deductible costs on a window, right. On the front street. So we made a decision early on as a mayoral administration and as chief of police that we are big believers and supporters in constitutional rights. And we want to see people exercise their constitutional right to assemble peacefully, all right, and to protest peacefully. And we accommodated that. We set up the areas necessary, we pre-planned. But the other thing we did is we got a hold of the people who were in charge of a lot of these protests, and we simply said, look, you need to understand the rules. Ogden is not Portland. Ogden is not like some other cities around. Ogden is not going to allow you to be, to destroy property, to be disruptive, to threaten life or safety, to cause businesses to bear the cost or to damage public property and cause the taxpayer to bear the cost. So here are the rules. And as long as you obey the rules, we applaud your right to gather and to say what you want to say, which is what happened. Our first protest was a little over 3,000 people right across the street, in front of the city building. And, but we had adequate resources and distance to allow them to do their thing, say their thing. But we told them right up front, we see a can of spray paint and we're not putting up with it. We see an attempt to do damage to public property, we're not putting up with it. So we had the resource available, we had the communication necessary to get that across. And I think they said their piece. I think they had the ability to accomplish their objectives as well. They had TV cameras that were recording what they're doing and playing it on the news. But we were able to do that. And then what happened over time is as things ramped up in other cities, as they got worse in other cities, because they weren't getting the level of activism in their protests here, and in the initial meetings we saw a lot of out-of-town presence. That began to dwindle and the protests got smaller and smaller and smaller, and so our presence got smaller and smaller and smaller. And as they continued, the few activists continued, they simply ran out of steam because there wasn't any way to encourage or to elevate emotion and create pressure and get good news. In fact, the news services stopped coming here because there were other cities they could go to.
And then the outside people stopped coming
They stopped coming, exactly.
Yeah, I thought that was, I actually applauded that. I had Malik Dio on here that, leads some of those things. And he had a lot of valid points that he wanted to make, and I think people often do, right? They have a list of grievances that were occurring, and they have the right to vent. But venting, like you said, doesn't include destroying someone else's property.
You look at what happened in Salt Lake City.
Yeah, down at the mall there especially.
Oh, yeah. And you look at what happened in Portland and Seattle and around the Kansas City and St. Louis. You look around there, and where you saw law enforcement and or city politicians attempt to appease that and or to participate and or to voice support, what you saw is escalation. What you saw were increases in damage. What you saw were, but what you didn't hear about is you didn't hear about the hundreds of other cities where law enforcement and political administration said, not here. We applaud your right to protest and we'll support you in that, but not here. So the reality is that the Salt Lakes, the Portlands, the Seattles, where there were literally millions of dollars of damage done, were quite rare. But that's where all the news cycles ran.
And that's probably why people stopped showing up here too, right? Because they didn't get on the evening news.
There's no news cycle for them.
Yeah, it's interesting that you have to push to that point to really get your point across. You know, I don't know, you know, where do we go from here? You know, one of the things that's worrying me is I've seen a lot of indications of this critical race theory being pushed into our schools, and I just wonder, you know, where we go and how do we bring parties together, and how do we have an environment where people say their piece, but yet we don't have to go to extremes to push this.
I'm very worried as well, because these concepts like critical race theory and rewriting of history, or changing history, and the emphasis on certain portions of it, I find very, very disturbing. I find them personally to be destructive, not constructive, to be destructive. They're not fixing anything, they're making matters worse. I was born and raised in Canada to U.S. parents, and so I came down here to go to Weber State, and you know, the rest is history. But my stepmother, she was Polish. She was from Poland, and you'll remember that in 1984, when Poland began opening up, and when the curtain began falling apart in Europe, she had a 16-year-old niece come over from Poland who was granted a chance to visit Canada for a number of months. She went every day to the public library, and she would come home crying because she was reading the true history of Poland. She was seeing the beautiful art and museums and things that had existed prior to the Soviets invading and taking over the country, and prior to the Germans exterminating the Jews in Western Poland. And she had never heard or seen those stories. She had never known the truth, and she was so distraught, and she would cry every day because of what had happened to her country. And I'm wondering why. You only need to look back not too many generations to see that effect and that impact and what has happened. And here we are in this nation where political groups and extremists and activists are pushing the same thing. Let's control what history we get to read and our children get to read. Let's control whose books they read. Let's control what media they read. Let's control what message they hear, that it's in the best interest of society. No, it's not. It's destructive. You know, where this country was built on being an open marketplace for ideas and philosophies, and it's why we were the greatest country in the world. It's why we are exceptional. It's why and how more science, more development, more peace within society, more great things have occurred is because of that. And yet there are significant efforts to revert, go back, move in what I consider to be totalitarian directions, and I'm concerned.
Yeah, it surprises me when I hear these stories of people saying, well, you know, because I look at Venezuela. I mean, you know, one of the leaders in southern
go back
hemisphere,
25 years,
right? They were the best, right?
Yeah, wow.
And you look at what's going on there now, and see how within just, you know, a few decades, they go from being the richest country to probably the poorest, where people are, you know, having a hard time finding something to eat, right, because of this. And then you hear the stories of, well, they're just not doing it right. You know, and I look at this critical race theory, and it really emerged, the critical theory part of it emerged out of a philosopher named Foucault that was part of the Frankfurt School. Well, the Frankfurt School was a continuation of Marx and Engels.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And, you know, this isn't economic socialism, it's cultural socialism.
Correct.
And I just see the harm that can come from that.
Yeah.
Right? And giving people these notions that, you know, and I guess I look at something, you know, I know the Constitution really looks at and tries to create an environment where we have equality of opportunity, but now we use this term equity, and equity is about outcomes.
Correct.
Right? And so you know, if you want equal outcomes, how can you have equal outcomes when some parties don't work as hard as others, or some parties, not saying that they're, the opportunity shouldn't be opened up, but it's just scary.
As you're aware, I'm also a retired colonel in the Utah Army National Guard. Spent 34 years active duty in National Guard time. I've been to a lot of countries. I've been to some of the former Soviet nations. I've seen and talked to the people, and you've never seen a more drab, more experience of existing. You see very little happiness. You see very little joy. You see, okay, I go and I do what I'm told to do. I shop where I'm told to shop. I buy what I'm told to buy. I go home and suffer through or endure another evening and get up the next day and do it all again. I've also been to countries and we're flown in to provide aid and other things where the gratitude they show to the United States for extending the humanitarian efforts that we do, and not only were we providing government aid from U.S. government, but we're fostering the even larger shipments that were coming from private entities, from the Catholic Church, from the Latter-day Saint Church, from large NGO, non-governmental operations, charitable, good people, caring for others. And I've seen where people have literally shed tears when the U.S. flag arrives. Why are we having such a difficulty inside our own country of realizing that? Why are we having a growing amount of turmoil over those kinds of things inside this nation when people are still, just look at the southern border, when people's goal in life all over the world is to get here.
Right.
Because it's still in their mind the land of opportunity. But to all those that are currently here, American citizens and others, is it still the land of opportunity, or are we morphing into, the beginning of Venezuela, the beginning of pre-French Revolution, the beginning of the Marxism era, 1917 revolution in the Soviet, in Russia.
Yeah, the whole
became the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
I'm as concerned as you are.
Yeah, what's the answer? I think, Reagan had it right. We are a shining city on the hill.
Mm-hmm, we are.
And we're actually more so than he was, capitalism's last stand, mm-hmm. right? And it's interesting how, we had all these powerful forces outside of our country trying to change things. That just made us stronger.
Did.
But now we see this movement, within our schools and within, kids coming out of college today, and they have a different, they don't really understand, well, for one, what it was like to have struggles. I don't know.
Exactly.
I don't know where that's coming from, but
yeah, we've been our success as a nation in defeating poverty, limiting and reducing poverty, and there are people in poverty, as we classify poverty here, but some folks could gain a lot by going to third world countries and seeing what poverty there looks like. It's a very different animal than it is here. Not saying it isn't bad here, I'm just saying it's a different animal.
Right.
The availability of government assistance and private assistance exists here that doesn't exist in third world countries. And were it not for the largesse of private organizations coming to support, there would be no support. People don't understand, and I think to some point deliberately the mainstream media doesn't portray what's going on in Africa. There's still significant amounts of slavery in Africa. There's still significantly high levels of religious persecution, including murder. There are still attempts at genocide. There are still, and you look at the size of the African continent, you look at what's going on. Some of those are the places, where when the American flag shows up, people show nothing but gratitude, because at least some of that will be taken apart. I worry that we became so prosperous that we removed a lot of the opportunity for growth for our youth. You know, I started working at a very young age because it was necessary. I think you're of the same generation, so I'm betting you held jobs all the way through high school. When I went to college, I went to Weber College during the day, and I worked night shift at the police department at night so I could get through college. So many, the system today seems to involve significantly less sacrifice than we had to do, so I wonder if the end results have significantly less worth in the minds of those who accomplish them. And then also the changes in education. I worry about how education is done, or whether even education is actually occurring.
Yeah, I serve as chair of the Senate Standing Committee on Education that covers K through 12 and higher ed, and you know, I think sometimes we worry too much of the culture and those types of things that kids learn, and focus less on reading, writing, and arithmetic, right?
I agree.
And I think we need to get back to that notion. Honestly, I believe that that education is the most convenient way out of poverty.
Oh, there's no doubt. I'm a huge supporter of education as a means of doing that. Look at how many famous people we have of various ethnicities across this country who did just that. You look at Thomas Sowell, you look at his life, holy smoke. You look at Ben Carson, you look at how he grew up and what occurred there. But you also have to, one of the things I have to admit, and there are a lot of teachers in my family, in my wife's family, our extended family, there are a lot of teachers, a lot of educators there. We've put a lot of stress on educators. We're expecting educators to babysit, to teach, to
acculturate.
We're expecting teachers, you know, how about we just figure out how to just let them teach?
Right.
How about we figure that out? How about we figure out how to get to a return to the nuclear family? How about we figure out how to deal with those outside issues that so affect, you know, how do we deal with the level of poverty in the inner city Ogden schools and the availability of teaching, you know, that for a certain number of the children in our school system here in Ogden, home is not a safe place. So how do we fix those kinds of things? How do we pay attention to those kinds of things that would enable learning?
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder about that. You know, in fact, I wonder, you know, in terms of, you just look at getting back to the police force here, you know, we used to have a lot of community policing that went on, say, 20 or 30 years ago, and you don't see as much of that anymore, where the police are part of the community and trying to get, you know, trying to help with some of these problems we have in the families and stuff.
Part of that is we have not been able to get to full strength. So and this is not unique to Ogden, this is across the state, this is across the nation. The nobility of law enforcement as a career field has been so dramatically attacked over the last 10 years, in the same vein as these other things has, that it's getting harder and harder to recruit and retain people. You know, back 3 years ago, there were over 600, we knew because of the numbers. You know, there are roughly 7,000 law enforcement officers, state and local law enforcement officers in the state of Utah, across the whole state. There were a little over 600 open positions that would never be filled in that time, so a little less than 10%, right? Positions would be open across the state. And we haven't been able to fix that. In fact, I haven't seen any real good numbers in the last couple of years, but I'm relatively certain it's worse than that now. So what it creates is it creates a great deal of stress on the individual officer, because it's carrying the load of 1.5
right.
You know, officers. the increasing negativity that is a very small part of society, but very loud part of society, has made it uncomfortable to be a police officer. It affects families, spouses and children. It becomes very, very challenging to have people know that your father, your mother are law enforcement officers. And so those things combined, plus, you know, but law enforcement in the state of Utah, not all agencies, but across the board, is reasonably good paying job with reasonably good benefits. But the employment market in Utah has done so well that there are so many other options available. You used to, in my generation of law enforcement, I started here in Ogden.
Do you think it's that, or do you think it's more this dissatisfaction that people have with the police and the attempts to cancel them?
I think that plays a huge role. I think that plays a whole role. I think the cancel culture and all of this wokeism and all this anti-police sentiment. I mean, I think we counted, you know, during the legislature that we dealt with 74 police reform bills in various stages, and that was an unheard of number of bills that impacted law enforcement.
Yeah, even the ones that don't. I know I had a bill in my committee that we worked on modifications for, but the initial thing was to set up these safety and equity councils at all the universities. And the thing that really bothered me is they'd crossed out the part that said the police report to the board of trustees, right? And I think those attempts, even though you know, people may be well-meaning with these things, but I think sometimes they go in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And
well, we've got to decide at some point. It's like teachers. We've asked law enforcement agencies to be everything. What is it we truly want? What we did at OPD when I came in as chief is we said, we're going to get with our city council, we're going to get with our city administration, we're going to define our priority tasks. What is the most critical item you want us to do? What's next? Because a bunch of stuff has to fall off. I had this saying, and the council kind of got a little bit tired of hearing it. I said, the Ogden Police Department can do anything, but we can't do everything.
That's a good statement, actually.
Yeah. So we developed a priority list of tasks, and we got them to agree. And so we were able to get focused. You know, Ogden 2 years ago, crime was going up across the state, but Ogden was still going down, and because we had focused our efforts on those key tasks that were necessary. If you're going to have successful city growth, if you're going to have successful task base, if you're going to have people moving in, if you're going to have visitors coming, using your hotel rooms, you know, driving the economy, people have to feel safe and secure here. So, isn't that the primary role of law enforcement?
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess that really is, you know, when it comes right down to it, that's the solution, is that we have to have leadership, right?
That's true.
And it really, and that drives a lot of things. Well, I congratulate you on the job with the Ogden City Police. I think that, you know, you left a big hole there when you decided to retire.
There's a good man filling it.
Yeah, that's good. It's actually good to hear. And I really do like the way that the protests were handled in Ogden City. I think that was, I was glad to get some insight on that. But we're out of time, so we'll see you next week. Thank you for tuning in.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.